Good morning and good afternoon from wherever you're calling in today. We want to welcome you to episode 8 of Terminal's AMA series, where you can connect with the industry's brightest minds from some of the most innovative companies and get their thoughts on the ever-changing tech landscape, as well as all things related to the future of work. We're thrilled to welcome today's featured guest, the award-winning Chief Ethics Officer at Hypergiant, a remote company solving the world's most challenging problems through artificial intelligence. He'll be joined in a conversation with Terminal's co-founder and chief strategy officer, Dylan Sirota. I'll let Dylan introduce himself and Will further, but before that, just a quick reminder on housekeeping items. All AMAs are live streamed on YouTube, and the recording will be available to view at the conclusion of today's discussion. As part of the registration for today's event, a number of you submitted questions that Will be sure to get to. But if you have additional questions over the course of the conversation, please type them into the QA function, and we'll get to as many as we can today. With that said, there's a lot to get to, so I'll pass it over to Dylan, who will introduce himself and our special guest for today. Dylan, take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Dorian, and welcome everyone to Terminal's AMA Episode 8 with special guest Will Griffin, Chief Ethics Officer at Hypergiant. I'm Dylan Sirota, co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer at Terminal. For those unfamiliar with what Terminal does, we help high-growth tech companies build, operate, and scale engineering teams across the globe. From recruiting to global employment to building tight-knit engineering-centric community, Terminal helps the world's boldest companies connect with the brightest minds regardless of location. Today, I am so thrilled to be speaking with Will Griffin. Will has some fascinating insight to share about ethics, in particular, how ethics should be integrated into the technology sector, how it can be a daily practice for teams, managers, and executive staff, and what the impact of ignoring ethics can be for our industry. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background, Will. So I'm curious, what is the career path for someone to become a chief ethics officer at an award-winning and renowned company like Hypergiant?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dylan, for the intro and the opportunity to share today. Career path to become a chief ethics officer at any company just requires you to be a very strong advocate and evangelist for ethics and have a strong sense of values. Don't look at ethics as a soft skill, but look at it as really something that's integral to the company. Now, my background, I'm a serial entrepreneur. So this is my 9th startup. This is my first startup with our founder, Ben Lamb. And this is Ben's 5th startup. And he's and 4 of them successfully exited. And I think Ben has a broad vision, which is delivering on the future we were promised. And so our goal is to try to use AI in a way that it actually pushes humanity forward. Before this, I was a serial entrepreneur. I started off like everybody. I tried to go to the best schools I could go to, work at the best places that I could work. Originally decided that I was more of an entrepreneur, kind of more wanted to call my own shots than be in corporate America or or stay in investment banking and consulting, which is kind of where I started. But in order to be successful, I think we're learning it's such a new field. In order to be successful, you're going to have to be very aggressive, and it's going to take a lot of conviction in what you believe, because you're going to have to convince developers, designers, DevOps guys that you can help them be more creative. If you teach them how to reason ethically, then you will stifle innovation, which is what everybody in space wants to do.
Awesome. Thank you for the brief background. So I think to get started today, it'd be awesome for you to give the audience a bit of a foundation or history of ethics and the intersection of technology. Because when we spoke before, we discussed how ethics has been integrated into medicine, into finance, and even law, but not really into technology. So why is there no common ethical framework in tech?
Well, so all the way back in the 1500s, when Descartes was a philosopher and he was also a doctor, and he integrated ethics in his system of ethics into medicine at the University of Paris. All the way back in the 1800s, law was integrated into, ethics was integrated into the legal discipline. So it was just part of the way that those disciplines have evolved. in computer science and engineering, there hasn't been a forebear. There hasn't been a history of teaching ethics or teaching philosophy within that discipline. So it results in entire disciplines that have no ethical training. So in order to be a doctor, you're taught ethics while you're in school. Then, as part of your licensing, in order to continue to practice, you always have to do continuing education on ethics. And the same thing is true in law. In order to practice, you have to do continuing education. But Silicon Valley and technology prides itself on the fact that anybody can do it. If you can code, you can get in business. If you have a garage, you can change the world. That's always been the philosophy. And the undergirding philosophy still today is move fast, break things, ask for forgiveness, not permission. As a result, the entire culture around tech and entrepreneurship has been action, movement, value creation without thinking about the underlying values. Over the last few years, whether it's with privacy and now with facial recognition, we're realizing that that point of view with that much power and that much reach and impact in the technology is tearing society at the seams. So in order for companies to survive, in order for them to be successful, and we also believe in order for them to uphold their role as a power player in society, it's incumbent upon them to implement ethics. And everyone in the company who touches a use case has to be trained on ethics and be able to apply it into their part of the discipline.
And just touching on one thing you said there, the mantra of Silicon Valley, I think the move fast and break things, I guess, where do you think that came from? What does it get wrong? And is there a better slogan that you think we should be mindful of as technologists moving forward?
I mean, I think it goes back to the origin story. So when Silicon Valley or tech began to take off, you had the East Coast companies and the East Coast players, the IBMs, et cetera. And everybody knows, historically, IBM is the man in the gray flannel suit. It used to move A, B, C, D. Everything was linear. The entire industry was founded on big mainframes. Everybody did their little part, and you were essentially a company man. Well, when Hewlett Packard started on the West Coast, they basically started on a similar IBM model. But the counterculture on the West Coast, people didn't really want to participate in that. So then when Xerox PARC was created at Stanford, it was full of people who didn't want to continue at that pace. They wanted to revolutionize the way the technology industry operated. And to be honest, it operated a lot more like the way you would consider West Coast record labels. So you would have an entrepreneur, and this is Steve Jobs and Woz epitomized this. They were in their garage, they started tinkering, and they believed that they could take on IBM and create smaller, more personal, and better computers. And so that created a whole culture where it said, we don't want to move at the same linear pace, snail's pace that the industry previously operated in. So the entire culture was renegade counterculture from the very beginning. And they came into the industry to upset the business model and to upset business as usual. But when that happened, that also caused them to ignore and throw away a lot of other norms. And it turns out that a lot of those norms are important for us to have a sustainable society. And that's what we have to do, get the innovation while at the same time putting forth our best and highest ideals. And that's kind of the vision that Ben has for Hypergiant. And that's what the ethics role at our company is supposed to do.
So given that, I think that's an interesting perspective. And I guess maybe the misconception is that speed is inversely impacted by ethics. Can you maybe unpack that? And I guess in terms of why are ethics important and why are having an ethical code maybe a competitive advantage for a company today?
Well, so the first step, and I'll talk about the way we do it at Hypergiant. So our framework is called TOME, which is top of mind ethics. So our goal is to make sure that everybody in our company who touches a use case can vet their role in the use case ethically. So that has three parts, and it's based on Immanuel Kant's framework, and that framework is deontological. The reason why we choose this approach is because deontology says, here is my duty irrespective of what other people are doing. This is my duty, irrespective of what else is going on in the world, irrespective of what else is going on in our industry. So step one of that, and we take every use case through this. So step one of that, is there a positive intent for this use case? That's called goodwill. Is there a positive intent? Step two is the categorical imperative. If everybody in our company, if every company in our industry, every industry in the world used AI in this way, what would the world look like? And is that desirable? And then step three is the law of humanity. Are people being used as a means to an end, or is this technology being used for the benefit of people in society? So that's a heuristic that everyone in our company can be trained on. So similar, everybody's familiar with the elevator pitch. Everybody's familiar with back of the envelope calculations. So we created tone so it can be a heuristic for using of ethics. The reason why that's important is because a lot of people think that you have to be you have to go to school and become a PhD ethicist, or you have to go to law school and master compliance and laws, but that's not true at all, because everybody who takes any action is operating based on a value system. They have a sense of right and wrong. Now, whether or not they actually vet their actions in order to make sure they're on the right side of morality is a different issue, but everything works from a value system. But we believe by using this heuristic tone, it allows it to go into the hands of everyone, and then everyone has a role to make sure that they're creating AI that's beneficial for society. The biggest question, I think the root of your question is, people think that if you do ethical vetting, that it will stifle innovation and it will slow things down. And I think if you look in terms of compliance, or you look in terms of law, the way it currently operates in the industry is compliance comes in, they give you a list of laws, they give you a list of policies, and it's a big checklist you have to follow during innovation. But we've actually found that ethical reasoning works a little differently, because it helps you be more creative. Instead of just thinking about the RFP that you've been given or the particular client, it allows you to imagine a broader range of stakeholders. And we found that when you imagine a broader range of stakeholders, it makes you more creative. It allows you to come up with more solutions. So I'll just add one more here. So how do you implement that into the workflow? So it basically, in pretty much every company works the same way. There's a tech problem or there's a business problem that either comes in the form of an RFP or a statement of work. When you get that, then your team, your developers, your designers, DevOps, data science, all the engineers come up with a whole range of business solutions. Once we get that range of business solutions, then everyone has to vet that through TOME, our top of mind ethics, our ethical reasoning model. The ones left are the solutions that we send back to the client. And we have an ethics review board internally. So they either accept your arguments, reject your arguments ethically, or they ask you for modifications. Most projects go to ask for modifications. Once the modifications come back, then that implores all of our use case developers then to be more creative about solutions to that business problem. So when we go back to the client, we're not just sending them back the solution to the business problem, but we're also helping them think about other problems or externalities that they didn't think about, that we already proposed solutions to when it goes back to them. And so it makes that solution more robust, and it makes it more scalable, and it allows us to add value back to the company.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing the framework. I think TOME is something, as you describe it, something that I think is immediately kind of actionable from teams and managers and product teams. From a Scrum setting, doesn't necessarily have to be something that's implemented from an executive level, let's say. But how do you think the overall industry might evolve? I mean, something that we talked about, in medicine, you have you have some legislation, you have some legal requirements around like a Hippocratic oath, and in finance, you become a fiduciary. How does that evolve in our industry? Is it a bottoms up that companies will see a competitive advantage by adopting an ethical framework? Or is there some other way that you kind of see technology and ethics evolving for a better future?
Right. So it's interesting you brought up finance. So when I first started my career, I was at Goldman Sachs in a group called Structured Finance. Within, it's a fair sounding name, structured finance. Sure, that's what Wall Street does. But within there, we had mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, collateralized mortgage obligations, and derivatives, which essentially 15 years later would blow up the world. The reason why that's important is because policymakers are not going to be able to regulate tech in the same way that they weren't able to regulate derivatives. And the reason why they can is because there's an arms race between all of the players to push tech further and further, and policymakers are not going to be able to keep up. So here's what happened everybody knows what happened in the case of mortgages. It basically blew up the world financial system, and within that, it blew up a lot of firms. Lehman Brothers, who had been around for 200 years, blew up. Smith Barney blew up. Solomon Brothers blew up. A bunch of companies that at one point or time or another were the leading players in finance blew themselves up. Well, same thing's going to happen in AI, and the same thing's going to happen in tech. Companies will blow themselves up. So if you'll look at an example of Facebook, IBM, people will point to those as an example. Well, Facebook was fined $5 billion by the FTC for privacy violations, which for Facebook is a cost of doing business. But there are less than 5 companies on the planet Earth who could absorb that level of fines. But there are dozens, if not hundreds of companies who could have the same negative impacts on the marketplace, and those will blow up. What we try to convince companies of is, unless you're these 5 companies, and you don't do what we're suggesting, and you don't vet your AI use cases through some ethical model and have your employees learn how to use ethical reasoning, you will blow yourself up and you won't survive. Now, for the 5 or 6 companies who can afford to pay the fines, what they're realizing now is there will be a huge backlash, which will ultimately lead to heavy regulation and those companies being broken up. So that's the market reason why you should do ethical vetting now. If you have $200 billion in your balance sheet, log off. You don't need what I'm saying, because you can take your chances. You can say it's just the cost of doing business. I'd rather fight antitrust. You're Rockefeller, you're Standard Oil, you're IBM, you're Microsoft. You want to fight all the wars. Fine. Most companies are not that. And companies will put themselves in a position where they'll blow themselves up. So I'll give you an example, a company named Practice Fusion. This was the first AI ethics case that the DOJ did an enforcement action on back in January. They were a high-flying startup. They raised $1.6 billion. They were a company that did digital electronic health record. They digitized electronic health records for small and medium-sized independent doctor practice groups. They aggregated 5 million patient records. Then they ran ML, machine learning across those, and then across the patient journeys. Based on those patient journeys, they began to do nudges. They began to make recommendations back to individual physicians on potential treatment plans and journeys for those patients. Within that, they also recommended prescriptions and medications. And in this case, they over recommended opioids. So they did 2 things. They ran themselves into a PR disaster with the opioid crisis. And then the second thing is they didn't reveal to the individual doctor groups that they were being paid by Johnson & Johnson and the pharmaceutical companies to make these AI-derived recommendations. The end result is a company that at one point was valued at $1.6 billion, got fined $150 million from the DOJ. They went bankrupt. They were bought out by a company called Allscripts, which is the largest player in the field and publicly traded. As soon as the DOJ action was revealed, Allscripts stock price was cut in half. So then they lost $4 billion worth of market cap. And then COVID happened and a bunch of other things happened, and their stock still hasn't recovered. And that's just one example of one company in one industry that could not survive the prospect of putting unethical AI in the marketplace. So now the question is, how could our framework have helped? Well, it's obvious this plan was only put out for innovation and moving fast. and deploying technology. There was absolutely no ethical vetting done at the time, because in our framework, the first step, it would have failed the first step, positive intent. Is the intent of this use case positive? Well, no, because once they used the electronic medical records, they used private data that they had aggregated to make recommendations to individual patients. The second part of our framework, the categorical imperative, if everyone who had access to your medical records began to make recommendations to you about future treatment based on data outside of your individual case, and they were compensated for making these recommendations, you would have conflicts of interest throughout the medical profession all over the world. And then the third part, were people being used as a means to an end, or was it designed to benefit people? Well, it was designed, the entire play was a data aggregation play. The goal was to amass data, mine it, and extract value from that data. It was not about what would have been the best healthcare recommendations for those individuals. So our model would have prevented, billions of dollars in economic loss. That's on the business side, but it also would have enabled us to use tech in a way that helped us with our duties and obligations to society, and consistent in our case with our founder's vision, which is delivering on the future we were promised.
That's a fascinating example, and I think speaks very, very well to the idea of tome and the fact that really companies can take the responsibility into their own hands. So thank you for sharing that. One other thing that you brought up, I guess, the DOJ, and I'm curious about how you think the role of government in terms of enforcing ethics is going to evolve. And in particular, the way that might flow through contracts is something that we discussed before. And I think it'd be kind of interesting to hear you talk through what that future might look like once there's maybe enforcement at a government level for some of this more ethical structure being implemented.
So I think government has a crucial role to play, but not from a legislative or a policymaking point of view. The reason why I say that is because of my previous experience with asset-backed securities. Policymakers will never keep up. So what you'll see is federal legislation, state legislation, local legislation that basically is reactive. They're going to react to cases where technology has blown something up or had a negative impact on society. And you also have the other part is there's so much money in the legislative and policymaking process that in some cases, like facial recognition in states like Washington and California, Microsoft and Amazon are actually writing the laws. So I don't think that's going to be a safeguard that's going to protect us. I actually believe that large government purchasing organizations like the Department of Defense will have the best opportunity to safeguard us and get their standards into the culture. And here's why I say that. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed an executive order that integrated the military and the Department of Defense. He did this for a lot of reasons, but the macro reason was the United States was involved in the Cold War, and they had just defeated Nazism, and they were going head up now with the Soviet Union and communism on a fight over values, over who would be the superpower in the world and under whose values people in the world would live. And it was rightly noted by African Americans in this country and all the other countries around the world that our freedoms and our democracy, our values would not be upheld in the way that African Americans were being treated. And so and many African Americans were coming home from that war, and they didn't benefit from the GI Bill. They did not have the same rights and privileges. It was still segregated America that everyone else had. So then when Harry Truman passed this, issued the executive order 48, military, he also created a mission which said that if you wanted to be a contractor to the United States military and the Department of Defense, you also had to integrate and you also had to follow the DoD guidelines. Keep in mind, this is 6 years before the courts issued Brown v. Board of Education, which desegregated schools. It's 20 years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act. So the DOD, through their values, forced their suppliers in corporate America to adopt their values. And that in turn changed corporate America. That changed the policymakers or political establishment. That changed the way our courts made rulings, and that set in motion the things that changed the way that we do business. So I actually believe that the DoD has a very strong role to play in this because when you look at the biggest right now, the biggest purchasing of AI happening is from the Department of Defense. Those are the largest contracts you hear about. Within those contracts should be these values that protect society, that are consistent with American values and civil liberties, and that in turn will force even companies like Microsoft, Amazon, and IBM to comply. So the reason why, in I know it'll work, we have some empirical evidence within the last 90 days. So because of the Black Lives Matter protest, it became revealed it was known to people who follow it, but it became revealed to the general public that all of these law enforcement agencies are using facial recognition to track to track communities, but in this case, it was being used to track protesters. Once society became aware of that, the blowback is what caused IBM first, and then Amazon and Microsoft to put a moratorium on the use of facial recognition. And it was also pushed from the government, which said, you're also a supplier to us, the federal government. And we don't need this fight. We don't want this fight. And so even though it wasn't in the government contracts that they have safeguards, it made them go back and revisit their relationship all the way around. So I feel like it's incumbent upon now. I think DOD will be the leader because they're the largest purchaser of AI at the moment. But I think the federal government generally using their purchasing power has the impact to inculcate these values into the rest of society.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a truly interesting perspective, and especially kind of going through the history of how that's evolved is something that I think a lot of us newer to the technology world, we don't necessarily see the impact that government contracts and purchasing power has, but you clearly articulated kind of how that has evolved in numerous ways. So thank you for sharing that. I guess one follow-up to that, how confident do you feel in terms of the DoD being ethically minded with their purchasing power? Are there positions that they have in place? And I think that stems to almost a larger question, which is when should companies or organizations be placing someone like a chief ethics officer? What advice, I guess, would you have for the audience and some of the CTOs and company leaders out there?
Well, for the DoD, I can't talk too much on it, but let me just say I'm very confident that they understand this role, this obligation, that they are working on it, and that it will have an impact on every sector and every segment in the United States and around the world. And I ask people who are on this call or are focused on this issue to keep an eye on the values war that we're in the competition that we're in with China. It's not much unlike where we were at the close of war, at the end of World War II, when we were essentially in a competition of ideas, in a military competition and an economic competition with the Soviet Union. And I know for certain that the DoD, in particular, and the federal government in general, is very aware of how our credibility and our values has to play a crucial and vital role in what we do going forward. So now to companies, and it never surprises me because you can look through social media, PR announcements companies are making. There are some companies in our space that are tone deaf and brain dead. they will be economically and financially dead within the next 3 or 4 years. Like, they don't understand the moment that we're in. And the moment that we're in was already a situation because of privacy and other breaches where people didn't trust companies and corporations. But then two other things, the two existential shocks to our society also make it very clear. In the case of COVID and the pandemic, people don't believe media sources, and they don't believe science, and they don't believe the companies who are supposed to be innovative, who give us the information. And that's being reflected in how people are responding to COVID. It's something as simple as wearing a mask. The trust is gone. On the second front, people don't believe, by and large, that we are living up to our values, and that the stakeholders in our society are not living up to their values. And the Black Lives Matter movement has brought that to high alert. Like, never, I've been Black a long time. Never in my lifetime have I ever seen so many companies universally feel obligated to come out and say Black people are equal. Black, we do care. Like, everyone had to affirmatively make that statement. And the people who didn't make that statement, are inherently suspect, to be honest, because they're not reading the room. They're not in step with the time. Everything that comes out of what's going on with COVID, everything that's coming out with Black Lives Matter, is basically saying to corporations, what is your obligation to society? Not your obligation to shareholders. What is your obligations to society? And I think the entity that's pushing that question the most is the World Economic Forum. So last year, the World Economic Forum obviously is made up of all, major governments, major corporations, some innovative companies, realize that if we go through with technology and the path as it goes with automation, robotics, there will be social dislocations. There will be people who are out of jobs. There will be entire countries and economies that no longer have a role to play in economic value creation. They're aware of this. And so they're asking all of their members to broaden their view of stakeholders so that it's not just shareholders. Last year, they coined the term stakeholder capitalism. The theme next year, because of the pandemics, makes them ask an even more existential question. And the theme is the Great Reset. How do we rebuild society in a way that every participant in it is a stakeholder and feels duty and obligations to everyone else? So I think we're in the middle. It's a great time to be alive. It's a great time to be an ethicist. And if you're in tune to your values, it's also a great time to be an innovator, because I think AI has an enormous and substantial role to play in building that new future.
Will, that's awesome, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. We're coming up on time here, but I could go on for a few hours more if we could. Maybe just before we go, a very quick question. What would you advise if someone really has never had exposure to ethics or different philosophical frameworks? What are one or two books maybe that you'd recommend someone maybe starting out to gain a bit more kind of perspective or history around ethical reasoning?
Well, I don't think it really. I don't think we can boil it down to one book, but I think you could. I think you could do this. There's an anthology called The History of Western Thought. Now, if you're a glutton for punishment, go read it, and you would see competing values. If you're not a glutton for punishment, here's what you can do. You can take that model I told you about, which is tone, based on Kant's deontological framework. Go step one, pick any decision you have to make. It can be tech or it can be not non-tech. Any decision you have to make, and go step one. Do I have a goodwill? Do I have a positive intent in the action I want to take? Step two, the categorical imperative. If everyone took the action that I am contemplating, what would the world look like? And then step three is the law of humanity. Is the action I want to take intended to benefit people, or are people being used to a means to an end? So I think you could play around with that. The reason why I think that that would be helpful is because it's a heuristic that helps you examine how you make decisions using the values you hold already. So it would be the question you asked me is like, well, where can I go to ask how to write a business plan? Well, step one, get your elevator pitch down. What is it that you want your business to be about? What do you want to sell? How are you going to add value? Well, what Tome allows you to do is get your elevator pitch basically down for ethics. Same thing for back of the envelope. Before I send you off to tell you to do financials, learn how to use Excel and do financials, I could tell you you already have the tools you need. You can do back of the envelope calculations to tell you whether or not this business makes sense. So that's really what I try to offer to people, a tool that they can use right now. I can guarantee you, if you use Tome as I just described it, at 99% of the companies, you'll be better prepared to use ethical reasoning than your general counsel or your chief compliance officer, because they think in terms of checklists and laws at the moment. But that's not going to help you when you're down at the front end of a use case and people are asking you to solve problems. What you need is a tool in your own arsenal that allows you to continue to be innovative, but also spurs your creativity as you ethically reason a broad range of stakeholders and the potential number of problems that you can solve using ethical reasoning as a tool.
Awesome. Well, I would really appreciate that last nugget of insight. I think everyone can go out there and hopefully apply Tome to their work, to their teams. And Will, I just want to say again, thank you so much for joining us. I think this was a fantastic conversation. We covered a lot of ground. I hope we can continue to do that again soon. But thank you again, and thank you to Hypergiant and the work that you guys are doing, and the ethical framework that you're applying to that work. So thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope you can join us again for another AMA. On behalf of my team, thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Thank you guys for the opportunity. Go easy.